Thanks. I know that this is the last talk in the meeting and that it's going to run into your lunch hour, so thanks for waiting around. I was born in Ireland. I still have the accent. I apologize about that. I'll try to speak slowly. I prepared this talk yesterday, and as I did so, it brought me back a year. And let me tell you what the market looked like a year ago. China had African swine fever, but they weren't importing much. And in hindsight, that was because they were killing a lot of sows, and so they had a lot of sow meat. But even if they were going to import pork, they were going to buy it from Europe because we had, at that time, a 72% duty, and the Europeans were paying 12%. We were using a lot of ractopamine, so even if we had access to the Chinese market, we were still going to be rendering a lot of the variety meats because we couldn't move that in there. In Japan, Europe and Canada and Mexico had preferential access because they all had a free trade agreement and we did not. And in particular, we were rapidly losing our most lucrative market, which is seasoned ground pork. It's a huge market. We were paying a 20% duty and they were paying 12%. In Mexico, we were paying a duty and the Canadians were not. And you could see on the unit values that our hams were being discounted to go to Mexico. So, and then my colleague at Iowa State makes projections on the profitability of the industry, and it looks like it was going to be a terrible year. That was 1 year ago, and things have really changed, and amazingly so. And so, where I was never so pessimistic about the industry as I was last year, I think there's some room for optimism right now, and I'll try and get you there. I am concerned about packing plant capacity, and if you're selling open market pigs, you're probably aware of that. But other than that, I think things look good. And there will be plenty of time for questions, but if you want me to clarify anything, please just raise your hand and I'll stop and take a question as we go as well. So I'm going to show you some basic data on the industry, so we're all on the same page in terms of understanding of some fundamental economics. I'll tell you what I know about the Phase 1 trade deal. I'll tell you that the traders in Chicago are very pessimistic about that deal. I'm a little bit more optimistic. I'll tell you about this impact of CSF using data that I believe to be true out of China. I'll talk about the packing plant capacity issue and some emerging issues about whether we can freeze enough pork to meet the export opportunities. One thing that was lost in the media over the last couple of months was that we do have, we're back into Japan with what's called the early harvest deal, and I'll talk a little bit about that and how we had averted a disaster in that market. Some of you are independent producers. I'll talk about what feed costs are looking like, maybe suggest that you lock in some feed for the coming year. And then I was in China in the summer to understand ASF, and I detected a change in attitude over there about imports. And I'll show you a slide from one of their presenters about how their attitudes have changed. And then a couple of months ago, they actually reduced their duty on imported pork from 12% to 8%. That's on the imported European pork right now. And that, to me, confirmed that their attitude about imports is changing. And if that's true, then this ASF will become a long-term opportunity rather than a short-term opportunity. But first, I want to do a little bit of economics. This is the only slide that asks you to think like an economist, but it actually is a true story. In 1998, we had some immigration issues with some of our packing plants. We had a lot of hogs that came to market, and we had more hogs on the market than the packing plants could handle, even if they worked on Saturday. And so at the margin, those extra hogs that couldn't be killed were worth close to zero. And some of you will remember that time. There was a farm in Iowa that actually released hogs and let people hunt them down. And that made it into the Wall Street Journal. Now, the interesting thing was the open market hogs that were killed by the packing plants were also sold at a price that was close to zero. In other words, the packing plants made a killing on those open market hogs. And that's because in a commodity market, everything sells at the same price on the same day. It's a commodity. It's indistinguishable. So the open market hogs that were in excess were sold at a discount, and the ones that were killed in the plant were also sold at a discount. That's just the nature of a commodity market. And so one thing to learn about that is, why should you be interested in exports? Well, it's that last last pound that's sold, that sets the price. And in the pork business, where you're exporting this month about 30% of your production, if you find one more customer, that increases the price to that customer, but it increases the price on all the pork, even the 70% you sell to the American consumer, and vice versa if you lose a customer. So that's important. The export market sets the price, as long as you have extra packing plant capacity, and that's a big concern at the moment. Okay, no more economics. What I did before I came up was just look at the size of the Minnesota industry to make sure that Minnesota was benefiting from the growth in the U.S. pork industry. And I compared the growth in the Minnesota industry to the Iowa industry. And in both cases, they both about doubled over the last little more than 20 years. That's not true in every other state. And I was talking to Dave about it earlier. I think in southern Minnesota and western Minnesota and Iowa, we have the soils for continuous corn. And as somebody who grows corn and soybeans, I know the value of hog manure. And I'm sure that that's why the industry in both places has grown. And I know from working with a couple of the integrators in Iowa that they find it easy to find new sites for finishing barns. And I suspect that if the industry continues to grow, that it'll continue to grow in Minnesota and in Iowa. That shows the hog inventory. I'm not going to read it to you, but the bottom line is that the inventory has almost doubled, and also the hog marketings have more than doubled. Okay. This is U.S. net exports of beef and pork. And over on the left-hand side is when I started at Iowa State in '85. The U.S. was the world's largest importer of beef and pork. And then it kind of increased a little bit, and then it took off to the right-hand side. And then I'll break out beef and pork separately now. The pork is on top, and the net exports of beef are on the bottom. And you can see that pork has been a major contributor to total net exports. What happened with beef is we exported a lot more beef, but we also took away the beef import quota, so we imported a lot more beef. And so in terms of net exports, pork has been a winner, and that's driven by pretty sound economics. This is one of the economic factors. What I've got on the vertical axis is the share of each country's total pork consumption that is imported. So the top number happens to be Honduras. They import 80% of their consumption. And the other numbers are all between 30% for Colombia on the bottom, and between 30 and 50 to 60%. Now, the countries are listed along on the bottom, and the key is all of those countries began at where the feed cost was at import parity. That is, they were importing feed. And then the issue is, and they opened their market to imports. And the economic question then became, do you continue to import feed to grow pork, or do you buy the pork directly? And I've done the transportation cost economics, and it's far more efficient to buy pork directly and ship it into a city like Shanghai than it is to buy corn and soybeans and put it on a truck and haul it up to a mountain and feed it to the pigs in China or in Colombia or in any of these countries. And so if markets were completely open, countries would buy the pork directly rather than importing the feed grains. And what we've done over the years is slowly open these markets. And when that happens, they stop importing additional protein as corn and soybeans, and instead they import, at the margin, they import it as pork or chicken or beef. And I'm going to get to China at the end, but imagine what would happen if China followed that pattern, if this concept of them changing their attitude is true, and they started to follow a market where they allow themselves to import 10 or 20 or 30% of their production. One more piece of fundamental economics. What we've got here are all of the export countries along the bottom, and then total production costs on the vertical axis. To get these, a group of us meet once a year. There's more countries that meet than I have shown here. The group is called Interpig, and we have these huge Excel files with 360 columns, 360 rows, where we have every aspect of pork production and cost and productivity, even right down to the cost of building a finishing unit, interest costs, cost of manure disposal. And at the beginning, we would just argue over things like, what is the gilt? It took us half a day to figure out what is the gilt. What is the carcass? Does the carcass have the head on or the head off? Do you leave the cheek on or the cheek off? So we did all this standardization. So now we can really compare production costs across different countries. And the U.S. is on the extreme left, and next is Mato Grosso in Brazil. Mato Grosso has slightly lower production costs than in the U.S., but Mato Grosso is not eligible to ship internationally because the wild animals there interact with the beef animals, and they all have foot and mouth disease. And as long as you have foot and mouth disease, you're excluded from international markets. So of the countries that are eligible to ship, the U.S. is the low-cost supplier. Yeah.
So maybe I'm jumping ahead of you here a little bit, but if you were to include transportation costs to a port, is that included here somewhere, or does that add on significantly in some of the cases?
So as you know, we have an excellent rail system. We can get stuff to Long Beach in 2-3 days. In Mato Grosso, they're putting it on a truck still, and that's over 1,000 miles to get it to the port of Santos in Brazil.
So this is at the point of production?
That's at the point. Yeah, that's correct. And these are actual farm records. These are not. So, yeah. And this is actually one that surprised me. So you can, from the records, you can extract profitability. And the blue line is the U.S., and the peak of that is 2014. If you didn't have PED, then that was a really profitable year. But notice there's a difference between the blue line and the other countries, and that's the logic here is that if you're the low-cost supplier and you're selling into international markets, you would be expected to make slightly more profit than your competitors, because you have lower production costs than your competitors. I was surprised at this because I thought the Europeans were getting a protected price within Europe, and to a certain extent they get a benefit from that, but not enough. They're not getting enough to compensate for the higher feed costs and higher building costs and higher labor costs that they incur. Now this only goes to 2018. If I did that for 2019, the Europeans would have been making more than us because of the trade war and what we went through in the last year. I just thought I'd show you what export looks like in the most recent month that's available. This is November. The top one there is the world that we exported about 250,000 tons. The number one buyer was China at 75,000 tons. Mexico was next, Japan, Canada, Korea, Colombia, Australia, Hong Kong, Honduras, Chile, Philippines, Vietnam, Dominican Republic, Guatemala, Panama, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Costa Rica, Taiwan, Bahamas, and New Zealand. New Zealand looks small on that scale, but that's 400 tons in 1 month, which would be 20 containers. So 20 shipping containers is quite a bit, and that's tiny relative to the others. And what Don will know from his work with MPPC is that we negotiated free trade agreements with a lot of those countries over the last 20 years, and once we get access to places like Australia, Colombia, South Korea, Canada, Honduras, Vietnam, not Vietnam, but Dominican Republic, Guatemala, Panama, Nicaragua, El Salvador, they become reliable customers. And so November was a good month, and I'll show you year to date later on, but the numbers are big, and it gives you a sense of how important China has already become, despite us still paying very high duties. Okay, this is what I know about the trade deal. First, there's a contradiction within the deal. As it's written, it keeps the retaliatory duties in place. So remember I said China had a 12% duty, and then they had a 60% retaliatory duty. Then they reduced the 12% to 8%. So now we're paying a 68% duty, and the Europeans are paying 8%. And then the deal goes on to say that the sales have to be based on market forces. Now, given the extreme shortage of pork in China, I think we can ship quite a bit of pork there and pay a 68% duty. But the big number has to be for corn and soybeans, and we are not competitive against Brazil and Argentina for soybeans if we have to pay a duty. And we're certainly not going to increase our soybean shipments to the amount that's expected if those duties remain in place. And so there's a contradiction within the deal. And as I'll show you in a minute, the people who trade corn and soybeans in Chicago are completely skeptical about that deal. They don't believe it's going to work at all. Maybe I'm naturally a more optimistic person, but also because I study China and I know they need the product, I think those retaliatory duties will soon be lifted. That's just me. Don't bet the farm on that one. But and also it's true that for pork in particular, two of the big traders are not paying the duties themselves. That's COFCO, which is really the Chinese government, and Smithfield, which is owned by a Chinese company and gets rebated on the duty. And so for pork, there's more room for optimism than there is for corn and soybeans. This slide attempts to put that deal in as described in perspective. The very top line shows, well, let's start with the blue line in the middle. That's all of our agricultural exports to all the countries with whom we have a free trade deal. That's in blue. The green line is all of our agricultural exports to other countries, countries that we do not have a free trade agreement with, like Europe. And then the red line is all of our agricultural exports to China. Now you can see that agricultural exports to China were growing, and then they fell up very quickly over the last year or two, and that's the trade war. And then as the red line continues to the right, that's the target in the Phase 1 agreement. Extremely ambitious. And I should have said that one of the other reasons for skepticism, the penalties that are going to go into place if China doesn't meet those obligations occur after the election. So some people who are skeptical think, well, a lot of stuff that comes out of D.C. is not right anymore, and if Trump doesn't win the election, then whoever does win will not implement the penalties. And so perhaps what China is doing is just waiting out the current administration. But as I said, I personally think that they will remove the duties, and they may come close to meeting some of these obligations. And if they do, it'll be soybeans number 1 and pork number 2. And I've worked with some Chinese colleagues, and they are also rapidly running out of their corn stocks, and so there would be some modest corn imports that they would need as well. Okay, this is the behavior of the soybean market for delivery in November of 2020. And you can see that as the harvest progressed, the market went up. And you remember just there in November, December, President Trump was saying things like, if we don't get a deal, it doesn't matter. We'd rather have no deal than a bad deal. When he was saying that, the market fell. And that was that V in the middle there. And then there was rumors that the deal was going to happen, and that's that increase in prices. And then the deal was announced, and that's that decrease in prices. And that's what I mean, that the traders are completely skeptical, that they're not building in any value into soybeans from the deal itself. And you all have to make your own mind up about D.C. and that, but I will tell you that China needs U.S. product right now. It needs agricultural product from just about everywhere, so I'm a little bit more optimistic than they are. For corn, it's a somewhat similar pattern, except that the corn opportunity in China is far less than the soybean opportunity, so the swings were not as great, but very similar pattern. Okay, a little bit about ASF. You've probably all seen this map, but it's essentially everywhere in Asia now. It jumped into the Philippines. It's in Indonesia. It's in Thailand, but they haven't yet acknowledged it. There's one thing that's interesting about Korea. The outbreaks they have are all along the demilitarized zone. I always thought of that place as like a no man's land, like in the First World War, where nothing could survive. Well, apparently pigs can cross that quite freely. The outbreak in China is vastly underreported. My colleagues from China have told me what happens. If you're a farmer and you report the disease, you get penalized. They kill your pigs and you don't get fully compensated. If you're from a province and you report the disease, your province gets penalized. And if you're an administrator of one of those provinces, you could lose your job. So the number of cases is dramatically underestimated, for sure. And if you get the disease and you're on a farm, you have the incentive to get those pigs to market as quickly as possible because you're not going to be properly compensated. And so as much problems we have with our own government sometimes, when you see a bad government, you come to appreciate how efficiently USDA works in times when we have diseases, and eventually how well compensated the producers can be and the damages that are caused. And just to point out then, everybody talks about China, but Vietnam has lost 30 to 40% of its production, and they're apparently reporting honestly, so you can see all the red dots there. And then the other thing I'd like to mention is that this disease has jumped already over the ocean. It's jumped into the Philippines and Indonesia, and it jumps because people carry food with them, and the food ends up in swill, in food that's fed to hogs. It's been shown by people who actually work for the pipestone system that the virus can live in soybean meal. It can live in vitamins. It can live in several products that we currently import from China, and so there is a concern that eventually we're going to get an outbreak of that disease ourselves. This slide begins on the day that the disease broke out in China, and this is official monthly sow numbers in China, measured, I think, pretty accurately. At the day the disease broke out, they had 31 million sows. And then it ends just recently when they had 22 million sows. So from 31 to 22 is 9 million sows. Is that right? Am I math right? Okay. The U.S. has 6.5 million sows. So in a very short period of time, according to the official data, they lost more sows than we have. And it tells you the magnitude of the hole that they're in. Now, before that, before the beginning of the outbreak, they had been losing sows in reasons having to do with the environment. They actually began this more recent period with 50 million sows, and they're down to 22 million sows. And so the kill-off has been tremendous. The environmental concerns had to do with people in cities just getting tired of pigs in the river. They were getting tired of odors, and the government was trying to move the industry to the northwest where there's a little bit more space. And so they were already trying to close it down. And then with this most recent coronavirus, the government is rapidly closing down those smaller operations all over the country. And so I'll talk about a little bit later about rebuilding or whether it will happen or not. This slide shows the live hog prices in red for China, and then in blue for the U.S., and then in yellow and gray for Spain and Germany. You can see that it took forever for the scarcity to hit in China because it didn't in 17 and 18. The prices were actually falling, and that's because there was a lot of sow meat on the market, but also because there was this panic selling, and millions of pigs that had the disease were sold into the market, and that meat was frozen, and that virus can survive in frozen meat, and so that meat will eventually come out of the freezers, or it's out of it now, and they get recycled into restaurants and into swill and back into new outbreaks. Spain once had the disease, and in one case there was a barn that broke 6 years after it had been depopulated. So this is an incredible disease to try and control. And from what I understand about the veterinary system in China, it's not as well managed as in other countries, and so that disease, unless the current vaccine works, could be around for quite a while. Now, you can't see this on this chart because the scale of China is so big, but European live pigs today are selling at a 60% premium over U.S. live pigs. Now, there's a coincidence here. We're paying a 60% duty, and they're getting a 60% premium over us. Well, it turns out that's what an economist would predict. If we're paying a 25% duty on beans and Brazil is not paying a 25% duty, you'd expect Brazilian beans to sell at a 25% premium, and that's how markets work. And so if those retaliatory duties are removed, there is some upside potential if we could have the packing plant capacity and the freezer capacity to kill the kind of volumes that would be needed. The USDA does ask packers to not only to say what they're selling this week in terms of pork and pork carcasses, but what they sold for delivery next year. And those lines along the bottom are other years, and That's October, November, December underwrite. And typically in November and December, the packers will start reporting sales for the following year. That's kind of, right, you'd expect that. And then what happened in October of this year, the USDA went to the packers and said, you sure you're reporting all these sales? We heard about this, that China's buying a lot, and yet we're not hearing. And so the packers were more diligent about reporting export sales for the following year. And you can see how big the numbers are. And one of those packers I met, and they told me that they sold for delivery to China all the pork next year that they can afford without losing their existing customers. So there is room for optimism for sales next year. And then this shows monthly sales in red for a typical year from 2012 to 2016, and then in green what it looked like in 2019. And if you look to the left, you can see in green how low sales were at the beginning of this year. And then look at the green line and look what happened as we approached November. The sales did pick up. I'll say it's not just China. We were essentially at a disadvantage in Mexico because of the trade war, and that was resolved in the summer. And so we're back into Mexico. The USDA is pretty conservative, and that's their long-run projection for pork exports. The actual is in black, and then in blue is the November 17 forecast. In orange is the November 18 forecast, and then in green is the November 19 forecast. And so it's not just me anymore. The USDA has now become very optimistic about long-term export opportunities as well. Okay, and then my colleague Lee Schultz maintains a cost of production for a typical Iowa farm-to-finish producer who sells on the open market and who doesn't get any premium of any sort. So kind of a somewhat pessimistic outlook. And then he monitors, to the left of the blue vertical line are the actual sales price of the animal minus the total production cost. And if it's above the horizontal axis, it means the producer was making money. And you can see in the middle of 2014, producers were making a lot of money. And then there have been periods, especially in the fall, when they lost money. And then using the futures market as of the 14th of January, he projected forward. And if you could lock in futures prices now, this should be a profitable year because of all that speculation about China. If you could lock in right now. If you're pork producers, you're all familiar with this. It's the December Hogs and Pigs report. A couple of surprises for me are the second line down in the middle is the breeding herd compared to 2018. The breeding herd was up 2%. And then coming down to hogs, 180 pounds or over, that was up 6% year over year. So we increased the breeding herd in what was a relatively pessimistic period. And we have 2% more sows, and those sows are going to be 2.5% to 3% more productive than every year because of genetics and improvements in management. So we're probably looking at 4% more pigs this year than last year. And last year we had 4% more pigs than the year before. So it's fortunate that we have this export opportunity, and it's kind of key that that it develop. This is a huge concern. I was at a talk by Steve Meyer at the Iowa Pork Producers, and I think he scared everybody in the room. Steve maintains a database of every packing plant in the country with their actual capacity, and then he monitors on a weekly basis what we actually killed. The key line is the green one, which is our kill in 2019. Remember I said we had 4% more pigs last year? 4% is a lot. And everybody remembers us building 5 new plants, and at the time it seemed like we'd never fill them. But if you're growing an industry at 3 to 4% a year, and you add 9% capacity, you're going to use that up in about 3 years, and that is what we've done. So here's the concern. What would happen if you took that green line and shifted it up as much as the difference between the green line and the blue line? What you end up with is a lot of weeks in the fall of 2020 where we exceed our capacity. Now, the futures market doesn't believe that will happen. It's allowing producers to lock in a price in the fall that is actually profitable. And so there's something wrong here between what Steve is saying and what the futures market is saying. And my suggestion would be it might be good to put some floor on prices for animals that are sold in the fall to take advantage of this China-based optimism. There are a couple of plants that might be able to expand modestly. And there are rumors that the Chinese will buy what are called three-piece carcasses. It's really you cut the carcass in 6 and leave the middle here and send the two ends over, the two side ends over to China, and then they use their own boning halls over there to do it. And so there's a plant in Iowa that has had enormous trouble getting labor, and they might be able to put in, instead of having one shift with boning, they might take that shift and put in a second shift, but only do the carcasses and just do the kill line. There might be some adjustments like that, but otherwise that's a huge concern. Again, at this Iowa meeting, I got to talk to a lot of people, one of whom was Christine McCracken, who really knows this industry, and she's hearing rumors too about a scarcity of both freezer space and chilled reefers, or frozen reefers, the refrigerated containers. China exports a lot more containers to us than we export back to them, but they don't export a lot of refrigerated stuff. And so what we need to do is find a way to ship, to find refrigerated containers to ship frozen pork to China. And if you go back to that chart, you remember that we're shipping just into tiny little New Zealand, we're shipping 20 containers a month. And then think about the scale of the China opportunity with them needing more pork than we produce. There could be some issues. Now, we do have a tradition in the U.S. of freezing a lot of pork in the fall and bring it into the spring or the summer, especially for bellies. So we do have freezer capacity. But apparently there's some issue with needing to have a blast freezer for these bigger pieces rather than just a regular freezer. And I don't quite know what that is, but I'll let you know there are concerns out there that we might hit capacity issue both with freezer capacity and with containers. Even if we didn't, we're definitely going to have capacity with packing plants themselves. Okay, I'm going to tell you a war story. And I'm not going to name names because this is a public meeting, but in late spring, early June, I should say that I work for National Pork Producers Council. I do their trade modeling, and Don would remember me from that. And I work for a guy called Nick Giordano, who is kind of excitable. So he called me up one time and he said, I need 4 slides. He was going to go meet a very, very senior government official who only was going to look at 4 slides. And I want you to make the case that the pork industry is in big trouble because of this trade war. And one slide I showed how we were losing market for seasoned ground pork to the Europeans. Another slide showed how the Canadian hams were being sold at a premium to our, and the third slide showed how our sales to China had fallen off a cliff. This was earlier in the spring. And the fourth slide was the bottom one here. And what it showed was my projection on our exports in value terms to Japan. Japan is by far our biggest value market, over $2 billion a year. Europeans had a free trade agreement with them. Canada had one. Mexico had one. And they were getting preferential treatment. We were rapidly losing our seasoned ground pork market, but we were going to eventually lose our market for loins and tenderloins. You can't compete in any market if you're paying a duty and your competitors are not. Okay, so the meeting is over. I'm not there, but the person who presented this is a very well-known pork producer, a leader, not a staff member. And at the end of the meeting, there was some chit-chat, and the senior government official told another senior government official that if even half of what these guys are saying is right, we need to do something. And then later on that summer, a rumor started that the U.S. government was negotiating a free trade agreement with Japan just in agriculture. And it's called early harvest, and harvest suggests agriculture. And then in the fall, that deal was finalized, and it went into place in January 1st of this year. So we are now back in Japan with exactly the same access as the Europeans and the TPP-11. And it never made the media. Unless you're really tuned in, you never heard about this. It was all because it was impeachment, Iran, whatever. The media was so busy with other stuff that it wasn't really fully announced. And of course, it's just agriculture. And what it brought home to me was at the beginning, if you go back a year ago, the industry was in big trouble, and the industry fought back. And people like Don, who volunteered his time to be on these executive boards, who go to D.C. for free, not being paid, and who fought back with slides like this, actually convinced the administration to implement the early harvest deal with China, to reopen the Mexican market with really what was really NAFTA 2, and then to have a free trade agreement with Japan. So it's not just a coincidence that we're back into these markets. It's because pork industry leaders went and complained, and beef industry leaders complained as well. This is exports to date. I'm happy to send anybody these slides. I know it's a busy one. In March of this year, I met with a joint task force, and at that time, things were really bad. We were down in our top 3 markets, which are Mexico, China, and Japan. They're the top 3. But the funny thing was, at that time, we were up in every other market. And one of the points I made at the time was, because of all these free trade agreements, we have this portfolio now. You can lose your top 3 investments, and your other investments can take off. And so there's a lot of countries that we're busy in. But things have changed. You know, we're back up. Through November of this year, we're up 7% for exports, and that's true even though we're down 10% in Mexico. We were down a lot more than that because we were at a disadvantage because of the trade war until July, and we're rapidly regaining there. And Meat Export Federation is spending a fortune in that country to rebuild our market share there. We were down in China, but we're way up. Well, let's talk about Japan. The Europeans have limited freezer capacity, and the Chinese are buying their product at any price they want to spend. And remember, right now they're getting, the Chinese can pay 60% more for European pork than for U.S. pork. So we are down in Japan, in part because of competition from Canada and Europe. But both of those countries are only paying 8% duty in Japan. And both of those countries have a limited ability to expand because of environmental concerns, or in Canada because they only get their price by law is set equal to the U.S. life price. So they're not seeing the benefit of the meat price that some producers in the U.S. are seeing. So my hunch is that we eventually will be back to stability in Japan, and we'll quit losing market share just because our competitors are going to be so busy elsewhere. Moving on down the line, I want to talk about Colombia. I think that has been a phenomenal success. Year to date, we're at about 100,000 tons. Chile, we're up 41%. Chile is an interesting one. It, of course, has better access in Asia than we do. I'm not sure that every pound of pork they imported is actually consumed in Chile. I mean, you can imagine some backdoor deal where we send pork to Chile and they send it into some other countries, because for them to import 41%, it's just, I can't imagine their consumers just wanting 41% more pork in a hurry. And then there are a couple of countries like South Korea that are down. And this is what I've learned from traveling to these countries. The importers there typically use frozen pork. They have rooms as big as this. And what they'll do is they'll watch the U.S. market. They'll be interested in certain primals. And when they think that primal price is good, they'll fill that freezer space. And they might have enough for a whole year. And so what happened in the fall of 2018 was we had some very inexpensive, in this case it was Boston butts. And so they bought a lot in Korea, and our exports there surged. And now they're kind of using that surplus, and so our exports are down. But generally, our exports to just about all those countries are up. But you'll see these occasional aberrations where they buy a lot in one year, and then they kind of deplete the storage in the following year. A little bit about the feed costs. Because of the trade war, so this is soybean exports in millions of tons, and all you need to know is the difference between the two tall lines and then the two following ones is about 12 million tons. So our soybean exports were down about 12 million tons a year for 2 years because of the trade war. And of course, that's China. The thing to know that you only harvest a little bit over a ton per acre for soybeans. Maybe a ton and a ton is about 40 bushels, so maybe a ton and a half or 1.25. So we've lost the ability to export about 10 million acres because of the trade war. And the same is true for corn. Now, most grain producers think they had a bad year last year. They had a trade war, and they had this wet weather. I actually think of it as the wet weather saved us from the trade war, because we had about as many preventive planting acres as we lost because of the trade war, about 12 to 15 million acres. So we lost opportunity to export corn and soybeans equal to the production from 12 to 15 million acres, and we took that much land out of production because of the wet weather. And as somebody who didn't plant 54 acres, I wasn't unhappy because of that, because I got an insurance payment that on June 1 was actually better to prevent plant corn than it was to grow soybeans, given the prices I saw on that date. And so we were kind of indemnified by the prevent plant payment. We took the land out of production, and then that allowed prices to recover. Now here's the scary thing if you're a grain producer. What happens if we don't have if we end up with a trade war, if this deal doesn't materialize as is expected by the people in Chicago, and we ended up with all those acres back into production? And the bottom line is we end up with, instead of having less than 90 million acres of corn, we end up with 95. We end up with trendline yields. We end up with a crop of 15.5 billion bushels. It better be true that this phase one deal comes true, because we're going to be swamped with corn and soybeans. Okay, I talked a little bit about a change in attitude about China. I know you can't read Chinese, but it's actually translated. And this was at a conference I was at in July, and this was the top livestock economists at their USDA. And first of all, notice it says replacing grain with meat. And then it says enhance food security. And then it goes on to say ease pressure on the environment. And as you probably know, given the nature of Chinese society, what the people tell the minister is what the minister wants to hear. And what this is saying is, if we import pork rather than produce it ourselves, we're going to enhance food security. That is, we won't have to import as much corn and soybeans, and we're going to ease pressure on the environment. The Chinese livestock industry is not environmentally friendly. You know about the pigs that were released in the river, and you know that they don't have a place to put the manure, so it ends up in the river too. And the people of China are just about tired of that, and they're paying twice as much to produce the pork in China as they would if they imported it from us. And so I'm sensing because of that presentation, I'm sensing a change in attitude there. Now, they went from 50 million sows down to 21 million sows, and everybody thinks they're going to build it back up. But they only have an 8% duty right now, and their production cost is twice ours. Now, why would the government reduce the duty from 12 to 8% if it wanted to rebuild the herd? Now, there is rumors that there's a vaccine, that the vaccine is effective. So 2 or 3 years from now, they might be able to start rebuilding the herd with a vaccine. Let's give them that. But why would you do that? First of all, you have to build new buildings, because the buildings that they've essentially eliminated the small and medium-sized production units. They don't want them. They're too close to the cities. But why would you build a new building to grow pork in a country that has twice the production cost, where maybe society doesn't want you to the point where they're not protecting you, when you're exposed to competition from places like the US and Europe with only an 8% duty? It doesn't make much sense. Now, it's possible that they'll see that and that they'll increase those duties. But then again, that would be violating their WTO commitments and possibly their commitment to the US in the Phase 1 deal. It's also possible that they'll become a reliable pork importer. And if that's true, and they imported just maybe 10% or 15% of their production, that would be in the 5 to 7.5 million tons a year. And unless they change their policy, unless they protect their industry by a lot, they're not going to rebuild. They're not going to build those new buildings, because 8% is not enough to protect them. And in the next couple of years, they're going to put in the cold infrastructure to get frozen imported pork out to the cities of the interior. And once that infrastructure is in place and people get used to buying pork in supermarkets, there might not be any going back. And so it's possible that we would have a long-term opportunity in China, much as we have developed in other Asian countries. We will see. I had some more charts in China, but I think I'll stop there. I've talked for 45 minutes, and I want to leave some time for questions.
what is their ability to handle imported frozen pork, get it distributed into the interior, the pace that would be needed to meet this kind of, what's their infrastructure?
So they have fantastic port infrastructure. I mean, they buy 100 million tons, they import 100 million tons of soybeans a year, so they have probably 3 or 4 of the world's most advanced and largest ports. They also have trains that are used to carrying frozen product. But I don't think they have the ability to move much frozen pork from the coast into places like Sichuan. But most of the people well, let me show you where the people live. It's actually a coincidence that you asked that. See that green area? That's the good land in China. And that's where the people live. Most of the people live between Beijing and Shanghai along the coast. And so I think my point earlier was, right now we have an opportunity to feed pork to the people who live in the area that we can get pork to. And then there's that area, it turns out that Wuhan is that area that kind of west but still populated, and then south of that is Sichuan. We don't have the ability to move a lot of imported product there, so they would rely on domestically produced product. But over the next 2 or 3 years, that infrastructure is going to develop. Don?
2 things. First is a point. Everybody should remember that slide about Japan. And remember the efforts that MPPC made to get that taken care of. The money we spend to support that organization is much, much less than what we are going to benefit from that. The second question I have for you, Dermot, is in 2014 we lost 7% of our pigs to PED. And we had a tremendous response. But the death of pigs in China has been far in excess of that. And it's been really pretty muted to this point. Is that all just controlled by the government in China?
So they went from 50 million sows down to 21 million sows. That's a lot of meat. And they actually killed pigs before they were mature. So what would happen is, I get the disease, I kill my pigs, you see that I have the disease, you kill all your pigs too. And there's a concept over there called double dead, which is my pigs die, I bring them to the packing plant, they kill them again. So there's a lot of pigs that went into storage that had the disease, either were killed prematurely or actually died. So all that meat ended up somewhere. And it took forever for that to get out of the system. Then we're paying either a 72% duty or now a 68% duty. And our packing plants don't have the capacity to kill the extra 4% of pigs that we had coming down the pipe. And they certainly don't have it next fall. So there's a combination of events that are working against us. But to your point, we only lost 7%. We could easily export 7% of our pork to China. And that hints at the potential if we could get around some of these capacity issues. Last question.
So we've lost half the sows in China, or a third of the sows in China for sure. Are we going to lose another third in the next year of what's left? Or, the news of vaccine possibly coming out. Is there anything that can change, the progression of the losses for the next year over this year?
I'm not a vaccine expert. I've heard vaccine experts say that it's going to be hard to get that product to market. Is there anybody here who is a vaccine expert who can do a better job of answering that question? It's a crucial question. I will tell you that they're making so much money in pig barns in China right now that they're restocking those barns far too quickly, and they're breaking again. Yeah.
Any idea how the coronavirus is going to play into this
I read the Wall Street Journal has an interesting story this morning, and it goes back to that theme of changes in attitude. So that virus occurred because people were in a market where they were eating snakes and bats, but more importantly, it was a wet market. And if you've ever been to China, you'll see all these chickens running around and geese running around and people touching, billions of people touching billions of animals. And I've said for years that that's not a good human health situation. And every year something bad comes out of China. And the point of the Wall Street Journal article is they're tired of it. They're fed up. They're going to change their attitude. They're going to completely shut down the wet markets. They're going to move the supermarkets. They're going to become much more like Japan. All of which is actually good for U.S. grain producers because they move away from a diet based on household waste, and good for U.S. pork producers because they put that cold chain and move the animals into supermarkets. So it is a sea change over there, and it's actually good news for the U.S. as long as we keep that virus out, both viruses out now. Thank you.